Sarah Mitchell's fingers moved on autopilot as she scrolled through her phone at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from pulling a double shift at County General, making her vision blur around the edges. The twins had finally crashed after their nightly routine of chaos that involved spilled milk, a toy war over a stuffed elephant, and Emma insisting she needed to wear her princess crown to bed, while Ethan declared he was actually a dinosaur and dinosaurs don't sleep in beds, they sleep in caves, which meant under the bed, which was absolutely not happening. Sarah had been a single mother for 3 years now, ever since the twins were 6 months old and their father decided that fatherhood wasn't the adventure he'd signed up for, and disappeared into whatever hole cowards crawl into when responsibility comes knocking. She worked as a pediatric nurse, which paid the bills mostly, but never quite enough, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was safe-ish, and survived on coffee and the occasional 5-minute shower that felt like a luxury vacation. Tonight she was supposed to send her hospital schedule to her babysitter Margaret, a retired teacher who lived 2 floors down and charged rates that were almost reasonable, but Sarah's brain was operating on fumes and muscle memory. She pulled up the message thread, typed out schedule for next 2 weeks attached. The twins have their checkup on Thursday. Emma needs new shoes again, because apparently children's feet grow at the speed of light, and thank you for being an actual lifesaver. I don't know what I'd do without you. Hit the attachment button, selected what she thought was her schedule PDF, and pressed send before her brain could even process what she was doing. The message went through with that satisfying little whoosh sound, and Sarah set the phone down, reaching for her lukewarm coffee and taking a sip that tasted like burnt regret. It was only when she glanced back at her phone screen a moment later that her heart stopped completely, because there in the message thread wasn't Margaret's name at the top, but a contact labeled, "Do not contact clinic," and the attachment she'd sent wasn't her hospital schedule, it was the twin medical records from their last checkup, including their birth certificates, and Sarah felt the blood drain from her face so fast she actually got dizzy. 3 years ago, when she'd found out she was pregnant, she'd gone to a fertility clinic for what she thought was just a consultation, and somehow the records had ended up in her phone contacts, some administrative mix-up she'd never bothered to delete, and now in her exhausted stupor, she'd just sent highly personal information about her children to what was probably a defunct number, or worse, an active business line that would now have access to everything. She grabbed the phone with shaking hands, staring at the message that showed as delivered, her mind racing through every possible catastrophic outcome, from identity theft to some kind of HIPAA violation that would get her fired, to something she couldn't even name, but felt lurking in her gut like a stone. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own breathing coming too far, and Sarah did what any rational exhausted person would do, which was absolutely panic, because this wasn't just her mistake, this was her children's information floating out in the digital void, and there was no way to take it back. The response came at 6:15 in the morning, which was roughly the exact moment Sarah's alarm was supposed to go off, except she hadn't actually slept, because she'd spent the entire night alternating between staring at her ceiling and Googling things like accidentally sent medical records to wrong number, legal consequences, and can someone steal your child's identity with a birth certificate, until her eyes burned. The phone buzzed on her nightstand, and Sarah grabbed it with the kind of speed usually reserved for catching a falling toddler, expecting maybe an automated reply or nothing at all, but instead there was a message from that same number, and it said, "Received your message and attachment. Need to speak with you immediately regarding the children born March 15th. This is not a scam. This is not a threat. This is urgent. Please respond with a time I can call you." Sarah's first instinct was to delete it, because obviously this was some elaborate phishing scheme or a scammer who got lucky with timing, but something about the message made her pause. Maybe the specific date or the tone that was direct without being aggressive, or the fact that whoever sent it clearly had actually opened the attachment and looked at it. She sat up in bed, her ratty nursing school t-shirt twisted around her torso, and typed back with fingers that still trembled slightly, "Who is this, and how did you get this number?" The response came back in under 30 seconds, which meant whoever was on the other end had been waiting for her reply. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm CEO of Chen Biotech Industries, And 3 years ago I was a client at the fertility clinic you contacted last night. The records you sent indicate you have twins born on a date that corresponds exactly with a procedure I underwent. I need to verify certain information. This is a matter of extreme importance." Sarah read the message 3 times, her brain trying to process what it was actually saying, because there was no way this was real. There was no way some random CEO had anything to do with her children, except the fertility clinic part was true and the date was right. And suddenly she was remembering things she'd deliberately not thought about for 3 years. The clinic she'd gone to had specialized in alternative family planning. She'd gone there as a surrogate mother initially because she'd needed money desperately, and they paid well. But then there had been complications with the intended parents and legal issues, and somehow she'd ended up being offered a different arrangement entirely. Something about donor situations and contractual agreements that her 24-year-old self had signed without fully understanding, because she was broke and desperate, and the money they offered was enough to change her life. She'd carried the twins, given birth to them, and then the clinic had dissolved under some kind of scandal, and she'd just assumed all records were sealed or destroyed, and she'd moved on with her life as a single mother who loved her children more than breathing. Now this message was suggesting that somewhere in that complicated mess there was a biological father who apparently was a billionaire CEO, and Sarah felt like the floor had dropped out from under her entire existence. She typed back with shaking hands, "I don't understand what you want from me or why you think you have any connection to my children," and his response came swift and precise. "The attachment you sent contains genetic markers and birth details that match records I have from the clinic. I was told the embryos created from my samples were never used after the facility closed. If your twins are who I think they are, we need to talk immediately. I'm not trying to take anything from you, but I need answers, and I suspect you do too. Can we?" Sarah's mind was screaming at her to block the number, to call a lawyer, to do anything except engage with this insanity, but there was something about the directness of his messages that felt genuine. And underneath her panic was a growing curiosity mixed with dread, because if this man was telling the truth, it meant her children's origin story was even more complicated than she'd thought. Sarah dropped the twins at Margaret's apartment at 7:30 with some rushed explanation about a work emergency that wasn't entirely a lie, because this felt like the biggest emergency of her life, then drove straight to the public library because she didn't trust doing research on her home computer or phone in case this whole thing was some elaborate hacking scheme. The library was mostly empty except for a few elderly people reading newspapers and a teenager asleep on a desk, and Sarah claimed a computer terminal in the back corner where she could see anyone approaching. She typed Marcus Chen Biotech Industries into the search engine, and the results that came back made her stomach drop, because this wasn't some random scammer. This was a real person with a very real, very public life. Marcus Chen was 36 years old, had founded Chen Biotech Industries at 28 after graduating from MIT with degrees in bioengineering and business, held multiple patents in genetic research and personalized medicine, was worth an estimated $3.7 billion according to Forbes, and had a reputation for being brilliant, ruthless, and intensely private. There were photos of him at charity galas, looking impossibly handsome in expensive suits, articles about his company's breakthroughs in genetic therapy, and a handful of interviews where he spoke about science and innovation, but never about his personal life. Sarah clicked through page after page, her heart pounding harder with each new piece of information, because this man wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful in ways she couldn't even comprehend, and if he wanted something from her, or worse, if he wanted something to do with Emma and Ethan, she had absolutely no resources to fight him. She found an article from 4 years ago, buried deep in the search results, that mentioned Chen Biotech Industries had partnered with several fertility clinics for research purposes, providing funding in exchange for access to genetic data for their studies, and one of the clinics mentioned was the exact one Sarah had gone to. The article was vague about details but mentioned something about controversy and ethical concerns, and the partnership being terminated, and Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle she didn't know existed, starting to click together in the worst possible way. She printed everything she could find, spending $12 in printing fees she couldn't afford, and sat at a library table reading through it all, trying to understand what this meant. The clinic had been shut down abruptly 3 years ago, right around the time the twins were born, amid allegations of mishandling genetic material, and violating donor agreements, but the investigations had gone nowhere and the records had supposedly been sealed. If Marcus Chen had been a donor at that clinic, and if somehow his genetic material had been used without his knowledge or consent, and if Sarah had been the surrogate carrier, without knowing whose embryo she was actually carrying, then this wasn't just complicated, it was a legal and ethical nightmare. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and looked at photos of Emma and Ethan, their dark hair and quick intelligence, and the way they both had this intense focus when they were interested in something, and tried to see any resemblance to the man in the photos on the computer screen. She couldn't tell, they were 3 years old and looked like themselves, but the possibility was enough to make her feel sick. Sarah had spent 3 years building a life for her children, working impossible hours and sacrificing everything to give them stability and love and safety, and now some billionaire was appearing out of nowhere claiming a connection that could destroy everything. She thought about not responding to his messages, about blocking the number and pretending this never happened, but she knew that was impossible because men like Marcus Chen didn't just go away when you ignored them, and if he really believed Emma and Ethan were biologically his, he would have the resources to prove it, and possibly the power to do something about it. She needed to know what he wanted, needed to understand the full scope of this disaster before she could even begin to figure out how to protect her children from it. So she pulled out her phone and typed, "I'll meet you, but it has to be public, and I'm not bringing the twins anywhere near this conversation." And his response came back immediately with an address of a coffee shop downtown and a time 2 hours from. The coffee shop Marcus Chen had chosen was one of those upscale places where a regular coffee cost $8 and came with some pretentious description involving single-origin beans and tasting notes, which immediately put Sarah on edge, because this was not her world, and she felt it in every fiber of her worn-out Target jeans and clearance rack sweater. She arrived 15 minutes early because she wanted to scope out the location and have an escape route planned, claimed a table in the corner where she could see the door, and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, which was still more than she usually spent on coffee in a week. At exactly 2 o'clock the door opened and Marcus Chen walked in looking exactly like his photos, except somehow more intimidating in person, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, dark hair styled perfectly, and an expression of intense focus that made Sarah's protective instincts flare immediately. He spotted her instantly, which suggested he'd done his own research and knew what she looked like, crossed the room with confident strides, and slid into the seat across from her without asking permission. For a long moment they just stared at each other, Sarah taking in his sharp features and dark eyes that held an intelligence that was almost unsettling, Marcus studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm, but she refused to show weakness. Finally he spoke, and his voice was deep and measured. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this situation is unprecedented and probably frightening from your perspective, but I want to assure you my intentions are not hostile." Sarah's hands were clenched around her coffee cup so tight her knuckles were white. "You want to assure me you're a billionaire who showed up out of nowhere claiming some connection to my children based on an accidental text message, and you think assurance is what I need right now?" Marcus didn't flinch at her tone. "You have every right to be defensive, but let me explain what I know and then you can decide how to proceed." He pulled out a tablet from a leather bag, tapped a few times, and turned it toward her, showing a scanned document. 3 years ago I underwent a procedure at Riverside Fertility Clinic to preserve genetic material for future use. I was focused on my company and not interested in immediate family planning, but I wanted options later. The clinic assured me the samples would be stored securely and only used with my explicit written consent. Sarah looked at the document, which appeared to be some kind of contract with signatures and dates. "Okay, so you stored genetic material. That doesn't prove anything about my children." Marcus swiped to another document. 6 months later, the clinic contacted me saying there had been a catastrophic freezer malfunction and all stored samples were lost. They offered compensation and apologies, and I accepted it as an unfortunate situation and moved on. Except last night when you sent those medical records, I saw genetic markers that are distinctively mine. He swiped again, showing what looked like a scientific report. "I have my own genetic profile on file from a health screening my company does annually. The markers listed in your children's records match mine at a level that indicates biological relation." Sarah felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. That's impossible. The clinic told me the embryos I was carrying came from anonymous donors who had signed away all parental rights. I was hired as a gestational carrier, not a biological mother, but then the intended parents disappeared and there were legal complications, and eventually I just kept the babies because no one else claimed them, and the clinic shut down and She stopped because her voice was shaking and she refused to cry in front of this man. Marcus leaned forward, his expression softening slightly for the first time. I think the clinic was running some kind of illegal operation. I think they used genetic material without consent and created embryos for profit or research, and I think you and I were both victims of that fraud in different ways. You carried children you thought were anonymous donors, and I had genetic material used without my knowledge to create children I didn't know existed. The words hung between them, heavy with implications. Sarah didn't want to examine. What do you want? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus met her eyes directly. I want a paternity test to confirm what I already believe is true, and if it is, I want to know my children. I'm not trying to take them from you, Sarah. I'm not trying to disrupt their lives. But if Emma and Ethan are mine biologically, then I have a right to be part of their lives, and they have a right to know their father. The paternity test took exactly 7 business days, which was 7 days of Sarah barely sleeping and constantly checking her phone and snapping at people at work, because her entire life was suspended in this horrible limbo where she didn't know if the children she'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for were about to be claimed by someone else. Marcus had been professional about the whole thing, arranging for a private lab and offering to pay for everything and maintaining a respectful distance, but Sarah could see the tension in his messages, the way he was clearly struggling with the possibility that he was a father to 3-year-olds he'd never met. They'd agreed to get the results together, meeting at the lab to receive them in person rather than by phone or email, because this felt too monumental for anything less than face-to-face. Sarah sat in the sterile waiting room of Cascade Genetic Testing on a Thursday afternoon, having taken a rare day off work and arranged for Margaret to watch the twins without explanation, her leg bouncing nervously and her hands twisting together in her lap. Marcus arrived exactly on time because apparently, even in moments of life-altering importance, billionaires were punctual, sitting 2 chairs away from her in the waiting room like they were strangers, which technically they were despite sharing the most intimate possible connection. The lab technician called them back together into a small consultation room that smelled like antiseptic and had motivational posters about science on the walls, handed them each a sealed envelope, and left them alone with expressions that suggested she knew exactly what drama she was facilitating. Sarah's hands shook as she held the envelope, staring at it like it might explode, and beside her Marcus was completely still except for the muscle working in his jaw. They'd agreed to open them simultaneously, which now felt theatrical and stupid, but neither of them moved for several long seconds until finally, Marcus said, "Whatever this says, we handle it like adults who care about what's best for the children." Agreed. Sarah nodded because she didn't trust her voice, and then they both tore open their envelopes at the same time. The words on the page swam in Sarah's vision for a moment before snapping into focus. Probability of paternity, 99.997%, and underneath it more technical language about genetic marker and statistical analysis. But the conclusion was clear as crystal. Marcus Chen was the biological father of Emma and Ethan Mitchell, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of reality. She looked up to find Marcus staring at his own paper, his expression completely unreadable except for the slight widening of his eyes and the way his breathing had changed, and for a moment they just sat there in silence, processing the confirmation of what they'd both suspected, but hoping somehow wasn't true. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice rough in a way she hadn't heard before. "I have children. I have a son and daughter who are 3 years old, and I've missed every single moment of their lives because some clinic decided to play God with other people's genetic material." Sarah felt defensive anger flare immediately. "Those children are mine. I carried them for 9 months. I've raised them every single day for 3 years. I'm the only parent they've ever known. You can't just show up now and claim them like their property." Marcus turned to look at her directly, and his eyes were intense but not angry. "I'm not claiming them like property, Sarah. I'm acknowledging biological reality and asking for a chance to be part of their lives. Do you understand what it feels like to find out you're a father like that? To know that somewhere in the world there are 2 children who share your DNA and you had no idea they existed? I don't want to take them from you, but I also can't just walk away now that I know they're mine. Sarah's throat was tight with emotions she couldn't name. And do you understand what it feels like to have someone threaten the family you built from nothing? I chose these children, Marcus, or maybe they were forced on me, but I chose to keep them and love them and make them my whole world, and now you're here with your billions of dollars and your lawyers and your rights, and I have nothing except 3 years of being their mother, which apparently doesn't count for anything. Marcus shook his head firmly. It counts for everything. You're their mother in every way that matters, and I'm not trying to diminish that. But I'm also their father, whether either of us planned it or wanted it this way, and we need to figure out how to make this work for their sake, not ours. The truth of his words settled over them both, uncomfortable and undeniable. 2 days after the paternity results, Marcus showed up at Sarah's apartment, unannounced at 8:30 in the evening, which was exactly the chaos hour where the twins were supposed to be getting ready for bed, but were instead having a full meltdown about whether dinosaurs could eat vegetables and whether princesses were allowed to wear sneakers. Sarah answered the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt with spit-up stains she'd stopped caring about years ago, her hair in a messy bun and her face showing exactly how exhausted she was, and Marcus stood there in dark jeans and a sweater, looking somehow both casual and expensive, which seemed impossible, but rich people apparently had that figured out. Before she could ask what he was doing there, or tell him to leave, he said, "I have a proposal and I need you to hear me out before you say no." Sarah glanced back at her apartment, where the twins were visible through the doorway, engaged in their nightly circus, and she really didn't want Marcus to see the reality of her life, but it was too late because Emma chose that exact moment to run past completely naked, shrieking about bath time, while Ethan followed, throwing stuffed animals and declaring himself the king of everything. Marcus's expression flickered with something Sarah couldn't quite read, maybe shock or amusement, or perhaps the realization that parenthood was significantly messier than whatever he'd imagined, and she felt both embarrassed and defiant because this was her life, and she wasn't apologizing for it. She stepped into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. What kind of proposal? Marcus took a breath like he was preparing for a negotiation which probably wasn't far from the truth. I've spent the last 2 days thinking about this situation from every possible angle. Legally, I have rights as their biological father, but exercising those rights through courts would be traumatic for everyone, especially the children. Financially, you're struggling based on what I've observed, and that's not a judgment, it's just reality. And practically the children need stability and consistency, which means disrupting their current life as little as possible. Sarah crossed her arms defensively. If you're about to offer me money to go away, that's not happening. Marcus shook his head. The opposite, actually. I'm proposing that I move to Seattle to be close to you and the twins. I'll find a place nearby and we'll work out a gradual introduction where I can get to know them and they can get to know me at a pace that feels safe for everyone. I'll provide financial support, not as a payment but as a father's responsibility, because you shouldn't have to work double shifts to afford basic necessities, and we'll co-parent in whatever way works best for the children. Sarah stared at him like he'd suggested they fly to Mars. You want to move here? You run a multi-billion-dollar company. I've seen the articles about your corporate headquarters in San Francisco, and your research facilities, and your international operations. You can't just relocate your entire life. Marcus's expression was determined. I can do whatever I want. Sarah, that's the advantage of being the CEO. I have people who handle the day-to-day operations, and technology exists that allows me to work from anywhere. My children are here, which means I need to be here. It's not complicated. Sarah felt panic rising. You can't just insert yourself into our lives like this. The twins don't even know you exist. How am I supposed to explain that? Suddenly there's a man who claims to be their father showing up out of nowhere. Marcus pulled out papers from his bag. I've spoken with child psychologists about the best way to introduce a previously unknown parent into young children's lives. I have recommendations from 3 different experts about age-appropriate explanations and gradual integration strategy. I'm not going into this blind, Sarah. I'm trying to do it right. Sarah took the papers, feeling overwhelmed. This is insane, you understand that, right? 2 weeks ago I was just a single mom, working too many hours and trying to keep my kids fed and happy, and now you're talking about co-parenting and financial support and relocating your life like this is normal." Marcus stepped closer, his voice softer. "Nothing about this is normal, but it's the reality we're in, and we can either fight about it and make everyone miserable, or we can try to make it work for the sake of 2 children who didn't ask for any of this. I'm not trying to replace you or diminish your role, Sarah. I'm trying to be a father to children I didn't know I had, and I'm asking you to let me try." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, seeing past the wealth and power to someone who seemed genuinely desperate to do the right thing, even if he had no idea what that actually looked like. "If we do this, we do it, my way at my pace, with my rules about what's best for Emma," and Ethan agreed. Marcus nodded immediately. "Agreed, whatever you need." The introduction happened 3 weeks later at Washington Park on a Saturday afternoon, because Sarah insisted it needed to be somewhere neutral and public, where the twins would feel comfortable and she could leave immediately if things went wrong. She'd spent those 3 weeks preparing them in the most basic way possible, telling them that they were going to meet a friend of Mommy's who was very nice and wanted to say hello, avoiding any mention of the word father or family, or anything that would require explanations she didn't know how to give to 3-year-olds. Marcus had moved into a furnished apartment exactly 12 minutes from Sarah's place, something expensive and temporary, while he looked for something more permanent, and he'd been texting her daily with questions about the twins that ranged from touching to overwhelming. What are their favorite foods? Do they have allergies? What kind of books do they like? What makes them laugh? What scares them? Sarah answered each question, feeling the strange intimacy of sharing her children's entire existence with someone who was simultaneously a stranger and their biological father. Now she sat on a park bench watching Emma and Ethan on the swings, their delighted shrieks filling the afternoon air as they pumped their little legs, demanding to go higher, and beside her Marcus sat rigid with nervous energy, his eyes locked on the children with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. He'd dressed down for the occasion in jeans and a plain shirt, clearly trying not to look intimidating, but everything about him still screamed wealth and competence in ways that made Sarah feel inadequate. She'd explained to him that he should just observe for now, let the kids get used to his presence without any pressure or expectations, and he'd agreed, but she could see how much effort it was taking him to sit still instead of running over there and trying to engage. Emma noticed Marcus first because she was the observant one, always watching and analyzing, and she slowed her swinging to stare at the strange man on the bench until Ethan followed her gaze. Sarah waved at them with forced casualness and called Emma. "Ethan, come here for a second, sweethearts." The twins scrambled off the swings with the fearless energy of children who hadn't yet learned that the world could be dangerous, and ran over, stopping a few feet away to study Marcus with matching expressions of curiosity. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "This is Mr. Chen, he's a friend of mine and he wanted to meet you guys." Marcus's face did something complicated, a flash of emotion quickly controlled, and he crouched down to be at their eye level, which Sarah appreciated because it showed he'd actually listened to the child psychology recommendations. "Hi Emma." "Hi Ethan, it's really nice to meet you both." Ethan, being Ethan, immediately asked, "Are you a dinosaur?" which made Marcus blink in confusion until Sarah translated, "He's in a dinosaur phase, everything is dinosaurs right now." Marcus smiled and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. "I'm not a dinosaur, but I think dinosaurs are really cool. Do you have a favorite kind?" Ethan launched into an enthusiastic and largely incomprehensible explanation of velociraptors while Emma stood back still, watching Marcus with her serious dark eyes that suddenly Sarah could see might have come from him. After Ethan finished his dinosaur lecture, Emma stepped forward and asked in her clear, precise way, "Why did you want to meet us?" And Sarah felt her breath catch because 3-year-olds asked impossible questions. Marcus looked at Sarah for permission and she gave a tiny nod. Then he turned back to Emma. "Because your mom is a friend of mine and she told me she has 2 wonderful kids, and I wanted to see for myself. And she was right, you both seem pretty wonderful." Emma considered this, then declared, "I'm a princess and a scientist. I can be both." And Marcus's smile widened. "You absolutely can be both. That's the best combination." The twins lost interest quickly, the way children do, and ran back to the playground. But Emma looked back once with an expression that was purely calculating, and Sarah knew her daughter was filing away this encounter to analyze later. Marcus stood up and Sarah saw his hands were shaking slightly. That was harder than any board meeting I've ever had. Sarah almost laughed. Welcome to parenting, where 3-year-olds ask the questions you're least prepared to answer. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her kitchen making spaghetti, which was one of the 5 meals she could cook reliably, and watched through the doorway as Marcus sat on her living room floor, building an elaborate tower out of blocks with Ethan, while Emma directed their construction with the authority of a tiny foreman. It still felt surreal sometimes, this new configuration of their lives, but it had settled into something that almost resembled normal, whatever normal meant anymore. Marcus had kept his promise about everything. He'd maintained appropriate boundaries, while gradually increasing his presence in the twins' lives, from supervised visits to regular outings, to eventually being trusted to take them for afternoons alone. He'd provided financial support that had allowed Sarah to cut back to regular shifts instead of constantly working doubles, which meant she actually got to see her children now, and he'd approached fatherhood with the same intense focus he apparently applied to everything, learning bedtime routines and favorite songs and how to negotiate with a 3-year-old who insisted vegetables were poison. They'd told the twins the truth finally about 2 months ago with the help of a child therapist, explaining in age-appropriate terms that Marcus was their biological father, which was a big word that meant he helped make them, but Sarah had carried them and raised them, so they had one mommy and one daddy, even though it was different from other families. Emma had processed this information with her usual seriousness, asking clarifying questions about genetics and biology that were way too advanced for a 3-year-old, while Ethan had mostly just wanted to know if this meant Marcus would take him to see real dinosaur bones at the museum, which Marcus had immediately agreed to. The twins now called him Marcus, not Daddy, which felt right for where they were, and Sarah had learned that she could share her children with someone else without losing them, which had been her biggest fear all along. Marcus had bought a house 3 blocks away, nothing ostentatious but comfortable, with a backyard and space for the twins to have their own rooms for when they stayed over. Sarah had learned to text him about their day and share photos and coordinate schedules in a way that felt increasingly natural. They weren't a couple and never would be. Their relationship was purely about co-parenting, but they developed a friendship born from shared responsibility and mutual respect, and the occasional moments where one of them would look at the other and say, "Can you believe these tiny humans exist, and we're responsible for them?" And the other would laugh because yes, actually that disbelief never quite went away. Now Marcus looked up from the block tower and caught Sarah watching, his expression soft in a way she'd learned meant he was happy, and he mouthed "thank you" across the room. Sarah nodded because she understood what he was thanking her for the chance to know his children, for the patience to let him learn, for the grace to forgive the complicated circumstances of their meeting. She called out "dinner's ready," and watched as Emma immediately began directing cleanup operations while Ethan tried to steal one more block for his collection, Marcus helping corral them toward the table with practiced ease. They sat down together at Sarah's small kitchen table that barely fit 4 people, with mismatched chairs and plates that didn't match and spaghetti that was slightly overcooked, and it was perfect in its imperfection. Emma was explaining her latest theory about why the sky was blue, involving science she didn't quite understand, but was determined to figure out. Ethan was attempting to eat with a fork and mostly succeeded. Marcus was asking follow-up questions that treated the twins' observations like they were genuinely fascinating, and Sarah felt something in her chest that might have been happiness, or might have been relief, or might have been the simple contentment of knowing that her children were loved by more people than just her, which was all any parent really wanted. The accidental text message that had sent her into a panic 6 months ago had turned into this strange, beautiful, complicated family that didn't look like anything she'd imagined, but was exactly what they all needed. Marcus caught her eye across the table and smiled. Not the polished corporate smile she'd seen in those first meetings, but something genuine and warm, and Sarah smiled back because despite everything, despite the chaos and the fear and the legal complications they'd navigated and the difficult conversations they'd had and would continue to have, they were making it work. Emma reached for more garlic bread with her tomato sauce-covered hands and knocked over Ethan's juice, which led to a minor crisis that required quick action and paper towels and the kind of coordinated parenting response that Sarah and Marcus had learned to execute without discussion. And in the middle of cleaning up the mess while Ethan wailed about his spilled juice, and Emma tried to help but was mostly making it worse. Sarah caught Marcus's eye again and they both started laughing because this was parenthood in all its messy glory and they were in it together now for better or worse. Later, after dinner was cleaned up and the twins had been wrestled into pajamas and convinced that yes, they did need to brush their teeth and no, they couldn't stay up late to watch more cartoons, and after stories had been read and songs had been sung and final requests for water and bathroom had been honored, Sarah and Marcus stood in the doorway of the twins' bedroom watching Emma and Ethan finally settle into sleep. Marcus spoke quietly. "I never thanked you properly for giving me this chance. You could have fought me legally or refused to let me into their lives and you would have been justified, but instead you chose to try and I'll never forget that." Sarah looked at the sleeping children, their faces peaceful in a way they never were when awake. They deserved to know their father and you deserved to know them. It wasn't about being generous, it was about doing what was right for them, even though it terrified me. Marcus nodded. "Still terrifies you sometimes, I can tell." Sarah smiled slightly. "Every single day, but that's parenthood, right? Constant terror mixed with overwhelming love." They stood there in comfortable silence for another moment before Marcus said goodnight and let himself out the way he did most evenings after helping with dinner and bedtime, and Sarah closed the door behind him, then leaned against it for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her life had changed in ways she never could have predicted. From one accidental message sent in exhaustion to this new reality where she was co-parenting with a billionaire and her children had opportunities she'd never dreamed possible. But the core of everything remained the same, which was that Emma and Ethan were loved fiercely and completely by people who would do anything for them. Sarah walked back to the twins' room and adjusted Emma's blanket and moved Ethan's stuffed dinosaur closer to his sleeping form, then whispered into the darkness, "I don't know how this all happened, but I'm glad it did. You two are so loved, more than you'll ever know." She turned off the light and headed to her own room, feeling tired but content, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and Marcus would text her probably too early about some question or idea he had about the twins, and they'd navigate another day of this unconventional family they'd built from chaos and circumstance. The accidental message had brought a billionaire to her door with words that should have terrified her, but instead had opened up a future none of them had planned but all of them needed. And as Sarah fell asleep, she thought about how sometimes the biggest mistakes turned into the greatest blessings and how love had a way of finding its path, even through the most complicated circumstances.